And it helps me as an archaeologist to be able to identify stuff when I get to a site. When you're chipping obsidian, you create certain types of flakes. And the very first part of the process, you take a big chunk of obsidian and you knock a big flake off of it. That creates certain types of small shatter. Then you take that big flake and you use a deer antler hammer to knock smaller flakes off of it to get into kind of a general shape of what you might be interested in making. This is a hand axe. It's actually a finished tool. But if you want something finer, once you get the general shape down, then you take the small tip of an antler and you actually press in and pop off flakes just with pressure. And that creates a third type of chip or flake. So when I'm out on an archaeological site, I can pick up the chips of obsidian that I see on the ground and I can tell what part of the process was going on there.
That's cool.
Were they just taking off the big flakes and the rest was taking place somewhere else? Or had they already taken off the big flakes and made the preforms somewhere else and were just finishing up the tool here? Or maybe in a hunting camp, the tools are already made. So all you need to do occasionally is resharpen them. So all you're going to find are the little teeny, resharpening flakes. So it actually helps me to identify what's going on the archaeological site. This area that we're in here, because it's all volcanic all around us, all the way down into Napa County, and we've got 3 different obsidian sources, actually 4 different obsidian sources here. Right here where we're sitting, Canocti. And Canocti obsidian is lousy. See if I've even got a piece here. It's pretty bad for chipping. Oh yeah, here we go. I'll pass this around. Be very careful. Always pick it up by the flat sides, never grab it by the edge. The edges are sharper than a surgical scalpel, okay? And they use obsidian blades now for cosmetic surgery because you can get it so sharp that it doesn't leave a scar. So, but this is Canocti obsidian. It's the whole Canocti volcanic flow is lava that came up through olivine. And olivine is kind of a crystal, it's an olive-colored crystal. This is actually called olivine basalt. And if you look really closely at all the lava around here, real closely, you'll see these little green crystals. It's in the obsidian too. In the obsidian, they're so small, it looks like zits. So I'll pass this around, you can look at it. It actually gives the obsidian a little bit of a yellow tinge to it. But because of those little olivine crystals, it's very difficult to predict when you hit the rock how your force is going to go through it. What you want is a rock that's nice and even all the way through. Sometimes your force will hit that rock and hit one of those crystals and bounce the wrong direction.
So when I run my finger over this and feel the little bumps,
Those
are the
bumps,
crystals.
those are olivine crystals. Yeah, if you had a magnifying glass, you could actually see the little green crystal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool.
Those are Borax Lake obsidian, which is just north of the town of Clear Lake, is the obsidian that was used most by Native Americans in this area. And it comes in different colors, well, it's all kind of gray, but sometimes the reason it's gray is because of air bubbles.
Oh, I was wondering.
Yeah, no, the obsidian's all black, but sometimes it has air bubbles in it. These are both Borax Lake obsidian. Very predictable, easy to work, and no zits. You'll notice there's no zits. That's the main thing. Now, everyone in here knows how to chip obsidian. You just don't realize it. Have you seen a BB hole in a window? Who hasn't seen a BB hole in a window? Everybody? You haven't seen a BB hole in a window? Okay. When a copper BB hits a piece of glass, like a window, it creates this cone-shaped piece that pops off the back. Where the BB hit is just a little hole the size of the BB, but on the back side, a cone-shaped piece of glass pops off. That's because the copper is softer than the glass. Sometimes a BB hole will actually crack the window. That's because that BB was made out of steel. Steel is harder than glass.
These two here.
So the whole thing is that cone shape. And if I were to take this big piece of glass, yeah, obsidian is glass.
That seat is taken.
I can stand.
It actually is glass. There's room over here for a couple of chairs, and there's a chair empty right here.
Oh, sure.
In fact, if you sit up here, you can see me way better.
The chair here, Joe.
This is glass. This has the exact same chemical composition as Pyrex.
Huh.
But you can't do it in the oven because what makes this gray is zillions of little teeny gas bubbles. So if you were to heat this up, it would shatter because those gas bubbles would expand. But it is glass, it's Pyrex. It's the same composition as Pyrex. So it's the same as that glass window. If I were to hit this hard enough right in the middle with this rock, which is softer than this, I'd have a hole right there and a big cone-shaped piece would pop off the back.
There's no more chairs.
I'm not interested in that. What I'm interested in is a nice flat flake to start with to make something out of. So instead of hitting it in the center and getting a cone-shaped piece, I hit it on the edge, so part of that cone goes through the rock and part of that just goes out into space, and it just creates a nice flat flake off of this rock. In fact, this flat flake came off of a rock here somewhere. So that's what I start out by doing. I take a rock. I can take a big one, like this big piece, and smack it, and get a big flat flake off the back side. It broke because there's a fracture going through this, but that's what I'm looking for. So we'll try another spot. So you can actually see where I hit and the actual radiating lines of the cone shape
Wow.
coming off the back side, and all I wanted was a flat flake, so that's what I got.
Huh.
Because I hit it on the edge. If I'd hit it in the center, a huge cone piece of obsidian would come off. So I'll start with a flake like this, and then use the deer antler hammer to shape it into a hand axe or something like that. Obsidian is pretty cool stuff. And sometimes I actually like to make arrowheads out of glass. And my wife's around here somewhere, and if you look around her neck, she's got a nice arrowhead necklace that I made out of some green glass. But the first thing I wanted to talk about was the rocks, the geology. We are surrounded by volcanoes. St. Helena. You been to the petrified forest over there?
Oh, yes.
Buried by the ash flows from St. Helena and turned into petrified trees. That's very, very well. That's the oldest volcano in this area. Then you get to about one and a half to 2 million years ago. Boggs Mountain and Quakenbush Mountain are volcanoes that erupted between 1.5 and 2 million years ago. Cobb Mountain and Mount Hanna 1.1 million years ago to 800,000 years ago. Canocti, 300,000 years ago to 600,000 years ago. The Borax Lake obsidian flow over just north of the town of Borax by Borax Lake. 80,000 years ago.
Really?
The cinder cones over by the Oaks where they're mining the red rock that everybody uses on their roads and gardens. About 10,000 years ago. During the last 25,000 years, there's been a volcanic eruption here. I'll pass this around. This shows the different time periods. During the last 25,000 years, there's been a volcanic eruption here about every 1,500 to 2,000 years. The most recent one that we're aware of occurred about 3,500 years ago. So what does that tell you? When you look at this map, you'll see there's actually a pattern. We got St. Helena, Boggs Mountain, Cobb Mountain, Canocti, Clear Lake, and the Oaks. And what's happening is that under the Earth's crust here is a hot spot. And as most of you are aware, the Earth's crust is slowly moving. That's why we have earthquakes, right? We're on the North American plate, which is slowly moving. And every once in a while, that hot spot pokes through. Mount St. Helena, Boggs Mountain, Cobb Mountain, Mount Canocti, the Oaks. As the surface crust slowly moves across this hot spot, every once in a while it'll poke through. So we know, or we can guess, where the next one will occur.
Are all mountains a result of volcanic?
No. Some mountains are the result of these earth plates pushing against each other and forcing stuff up.
Thank you.
Yeah. The next one's going to be in Long Valley, or in that general area. So, you know, get some property out there, and you'll have a front row seat.
The next what?
The next volcanic eruption.
And how are you determined, just by your,
By this map that shows the sequence over the past 1.5 to 2 million
I
years.
guess I'm not getting it now.
Well, St. Helena's down here, that was the first one. Then we got this one, then we got this one.
So they kind of travel along
Yeah.
the fault line?
No.
No,
No, it's underneath the Earth's crust
yeah,
is this hot spot, and the Earth's crust is slowly moving.
so
And every once in a while, the hot spot pokes through and creates a volcano.
so that shows you where the crust is moving
Right, the
towards.
direction that the crust is moving, so I can tell where the next poke through is
Well,
going to
that's interesting.
Where's Long Valley? Where is Long
Yeah,
Valley?
where's Long Valley?
Where's Long Valley?
East of here.
If you take Highway 20 out towards the Central Valley, you'll pass the Long Valley Road.
New Long
New
Valley.
Long Valley Road. And that's, you know, these are all just theories and hypotheses based on facts. I'm going to talk about facts, and I'm going to talk about hypotheses all day long. And when I think about it, I'll tell you, this is the fact. This is my hypothesis. And what is a hypothesis? Anybody know?
An educated guess.
We hope it's an intelligent guess based on facts. Yeah, so that's the geology of the mountains around here. The lake, I'm going to repeat a lot of stuff that a lot of you are docents that work here, and you've already heard this stuff. Some of you have been in my talks before and may have heard it. Tough shit, you're going to hear it again.
What mountain was that?
This is the oldest lake in the Americas. Yeah,
Oh,
the oldest lake in the Americas. The way you see it right now, it's sat there for 500,000 years, 500,000 years. This lake has been there, right there as you see it. When the U.S. Geological Survey was here in the late 70s and did core samples of lake bed sediment, they went down 400 feet and never hit bedrock, never hit the bottom of the lake bed sediments. So we have 400 feet of lake bed sediments going back 500,000 years.
Wow.
That's as deep as they could dig at the time. We don't know how old the lake really is. We know that there has been a lake or a marsh area in this basin for 2 million years. It may be that this lake is 2 million years old. We don't know. We know at least it's 500,000 years
Does
old.
that include South America as well?
That includes South America, North America, Alaska,
Lake Titicaca?
Lake Titicaca, yes. We're older than anything in the Americas.
Wow.
Yeah, right here. And why is this lake here? Well, when you have volcanic stuff like this, magma from underneath the Earth's crust comes up to the surface and spreads out. It creates a void underneath the Earth's crust there. So there's a little bit of downfaulting to fill in that void. It's called a graben, where you have downfaulting next to a volcano.
How do you spell that?
With a G.
That part I got. Is it after somebody's name?
Yeah, it's just sounded out. Graben. I don't know.
Oh, graben.
Graben,
Okay.
yeah,
But it's a-
Grabin.
Oh, okay.
That's a graben. It's a geological term.
Yeah, I've never
You
heard
know,
it.
those guys are always coming up with weird. They drink a lot of beer, you know, and I think that's. Never mind. And so this basin is downfaulting very regularly at a very even rate, about the rate that your fingernail grows every year.
Lord.
So, how often do you clip your fingernails? Just think of next time you clip your fingernails, oh my, the lake just dropped another 3 centimeters. That downfaulting, you'd think eventually the lake would be so deep, right? Well, it turns out during every rainy season, dirt and mud and
Sediment.
silt comes in from all the surrounding streams. That silt load has perfectly balanced the downfaulting, which is why this lake has been here 500,000 years. Perfect balance between the amount of silt coming in and the downfaulting. The lake all the way across the upper end, 25 feet deep. Very shallow. Lakes usually, the silt fills them up, they become valleys. You know, you go up into the Sierras, you get these big meadows. Used to be a lake. Silted up, became a valley. If we were ever to introduce a new load of sediment into Clear Lake, that would happen here because it would throw off that downfaulting sediment balance. And so it's a very sensitive ecosystem. And over the last 100 years, we have monkeyed with it an awful
I was
lot.
gonna say that. What
You
about,
know, there's all these go ahead.
well, like, for instance, the fires that, and you lose that, the root system that kind of holds soils in
Right.
place and everything, so then,
Yeah, the fires create a lot of extra sediment. Putting in vineyards creates a lot of extra sediment. But, you know, the lake there's been fires around this lake for 500,000 years. So
Okay,
that's part of the natural
okay.
scheme of things.
No vineyards being put in.
The vineyards, right, vineyards are new. So, yeah, that's a new thing. And we don't yet know what the final effect of that is, but, you know, I'd like wine, so I don't even care.
And it's just
Buy an
not,
Eli wine glass and
Yeah,
you too can not worry about it. Where was I?
oh,
Oh,
I'm sorry.
that's okay. I'm gonna be wandering all over the place, so.
Nice.
Bring me back if you find that I'm wandering too far. So the lake, the neat thing about such an old lake with 400 feet of sediments is that they were able to take those core samples and dissect them. And under a high-powered microscope, they actually were able to count the different pollen grains as you go up through those core samples. And by doing that, they can recreate the environment around the lake basin over the past so many millions, so many thousands of years.
Who's doing that?
The U.S. Geological Survey
Oh, okay.
did this. They started the project back in the late 70s. And just last year or year before, a researcher from Berkeley came up and took more core samples in, the original USGS samples kind of pinpointed areas that we needed to study further. And so the Berkeley a researcher came up and took more core samples in the part of the lake that we think is the oldest to
Which-
see,
Which is what part?
right off the shore of Lucerne,
Oh, okay.
little ways out. The lake did shrink a little bit during the last global warming period. It was more narrow and long, but it went from Upper Lake all the way down to Clear Lake. So it was a little bit smaller.
How did you determine the oldest part of the lake?
Oh,
How was that determined?
they took core samples all the way across the main body of the lake,
Thank you.
and then they took several core samples down the Oaks Arm and the Clear Lake Arm. And they were actually able to see in those core samples the alluvial deposits from Kelsey Creek and Middle Creek and Adobe Creek. So they were able to figure out, okay, this spot here is probably the oldest because it's not covered by all these more recent deposits. Yeah. Yeah. Big Valley, Kelsey Creek and Adobe Creek flowing through Big Valley used to overflow their banks every year, depositing a little bit of silt every year across the whole valley. And Kelsey Creek meandered back and forth across that valley over thousands of years. And actually we have an archaeological site in the bottom of Kelsey Creek that's about 20 feet below the valley floor. And that site is 6,000 years old.
Wow.
So in the past 6,000 years, 20 feet of sediment has built up in Big Valley. You know, so now because of gravel operations and we're trying to channelize the creeks because nobody wants to be flooded out, that doesn't happen anymore. It all goes down into the lake now. Anyways, so that's geology. And what I'm going to talk about now, unless you want to hear more about geology.
Yes, please.
Yes?
Well, what different types of rocks? I mean, we've talked about.
Obsidian I talk about a lot
Yeah.
because that's
What other types?
that's the rock that's most closely related to the Native Americans who lived here, which is what I really study.
Oh, okay.
The mountains around us and around this volcanic stuff is called the Franciscan Formation. And the Franciscan Formation is Cherts, the State Rock, which is Serpentine.
Yeah.
Oh my God. Okay, Chert, Serpentine, a neat rock called Gray Wacky. You knew they were drunk when they invented that. And Conglomerate, which is, you know, a bunch of gravels and sands all stuck together and fused together to make a rock. Sandstones. The Franciscan Formation was created in a deep ocean when this part of the Earth's crust was actually under the ocean. And little single cell small critters in the ocean would die and sink to the bottom and form an ooze. And that ooze got compressed and heated and became what we call chert, which is kind of like flint, if some of you are familiar with flint. That's the other rock that the Native Americans used to chip to make arrowheads and spear points. It's Franciscan Formation. The north end of the lake, we get a lot of chert artifacts because there's more Franciscan Formation up there than down here. Down here, because the obsidian is right under our feet, most of the artifacts are made out of obsidian. But there's certain artifacts that you want made out of chert. If you want to drill a hole in a shell bead, you want a chert drill tip because it's a lot stronger and holds its edge a lot longer than obsidian. Obsidian is very fragile and chips and breaks very easily. So obsidian's good for certain things,
Makes it very sharp.
like spear points. I'll pass these around. These are all spear points.
I saw them. I was looking over things.
Now the very first people, and okay, the fact is we have an obsidian knife that was found over at the Elam Indian colony that we were able to date to 20,000 years old.
Wow.
20,000 years old.
Oh,
As far as I know, it's the oldest artifact in North America. There are artifacts in Central America that are older.
huh.
It's the oldest one that I know of in North America.
I dug up a church spearhead that was 6 feet underground.
Uh-huh,
That puts, pretty old, I would say.
maybe, it could be.
Yeah.
There's certain styles that we know were made during certain time periods. So, and I'll give you a handout that actually shows you the style.
Oh, great.
Everybody gets a handout.
Oh, good.
We think that the very first people were here 20,000 years ago. Otherwise, how did that obsidian knife get there? And it was obsidian from Napa, from the Napa obsidian flow.
Oh,
Napa obsidian, I'll pass this around. Doesn't really look like obsidian in its natural form until you break it open. Napa obsidian is so black and so dense you can't see through it. Even a thin piece of Napa obsidian, you can't see through it. And it looks like the surface is actually covered with oil. So I can tell the difference by looking at a piece of obsidian. Is that canocti, is that borax slate, is that Napa obsidian?
oh,
Napa obsidian, so these were people that were traveling. And 20,000 years ago, there were very few people in the Americas. They were roaming small groups of people, maybe 20, 30, couple of families, you know, moving here and there, yeah.
can I ask a quick question about lakes before you get
Oh,
further
yeah,
into
yeah.
people? How do the Blue Lakes figure into the creation of Clear Lake?
Okay, actually, I never really finished Clear Lake. Because Clear Lake has been here so long, it has flowed out of this basin different directions during different times during its life. At one time, in fact, at several times probably, it flowed out through the Blue Lake Canyon down into the Russian River. You know how
Oh, wow.
deep and how deep that canyon is?
Yeah.
That canyon is way too deep for that little teeny trickle of a creek that's
Yeah.
going through there to have caused it. If you go out Highway 20 towards the valley and you go 16 through the Cache Creek Canyon, equally deep and steep-sided, that's where Clear Lake is flowing out now.
Yeah.
Okay, originally, we don't know where it originally started flowing out. We know that the most recent change in its outflow was about 12,000 years ago.
Wow.
It was flowing to the Russian River through the Blue Lakes area.
Oh,
And then there was a minor tectonic shift which deepened the southern arm of the lake, shutting off that outflow.
huh.
And for a few hundred years, the lake level rose 85 feet higher than it is today,
Wow.
until it crested a kind of a low bank down outside of Lower Lake called Red Bank Gorge. And it went over Red Bank Gorge and started cutting through
wearing
the
it
Red
down.
Bank, carving it down to the level that it's at now. And that happened about 12,000 years ago. Now, before then, we figure it's gone back and forth. And it may not always have gone just through Upper Lake and Blue Lakes. It may have gone around where Scotts Creek goes. That may have been the outlet, because the Scotts Creek Canyon is very deep. And it may not have always gone down through the Cache Creek Canyon. It may have at one time gone down past Hidden Valley Lake to Poudre Creek, because there's a pretty good canyon that goes that direction. You know, so you're looking at these topographic maps and you're looking at where these canyons are, and you're thinking, you know, this little creek that's flowing through this canyon could not have created such a deep, big canyon. So it must have been Clear Lake's outflow at one time. We haven't been able to date when those other things occurred. It's just a hypothesis.
I've heard some people say that the Blue Lakes connect underground with.
There's all kinds of myths and legends in this county, and I've heard that. I've heard there's a huge treasure chest of gold in the bottom of Blue Lakes, but nobody can get to it because it's so deep. And yeah, I've heard that you can drop a stick carved in Blue Lakes and you'll find it floating in Clear Lake.
Yeah.
You know, there's all. We can talk about fantasy stuff if you'd like, but I'm more of a scientist than.
So there's no evidence that there's
No.
an underground connection?
No.
Okay.
Blue Lakes actually weren't lakes until a landslide that occurred much later. There's just at the north end of Blue Lakes. You go up that rise. You know where the passing lane is?
Yeah,
Yeah. Anyway, that's an old landslide that came down from the mountains and came across the valley and dammed that area off there, and that's when the lakes were created. They're spring fed and created by that landslide. Before the landslide, all the spring water went that way towards the Russian River.
Okay. Huh.
So is it deeper than Clear Lake?
Blue Lakes?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, that's a deep canyon.
Yes.
Go down Highway 16, down the Cache Creek Canyon. That's how deep and steep that canyon is.
No.
Yeah. It's good trout fishing. Yeah.
And you could eat them.
Yes, and you can eat. You know, at our age, you can eat any fish in this lake without a worry or a
For grandkids too.
Back to the very first people. The oldest languages that historical linguists have been able to record in the New World are a language family called the Yukian language family and the Hokan language family. If you take all these different languages, you can pick and choose words from different languages that sound the same, like mother, madre, father, padre, pater. You know, I mean, those are just the Romance language. You know, you can actually reconstruct what the proto-language was. And historical linguists have taken all of the American Indian languages and done that. And they've gone back to these two language families, which they believe are the oldest in the New World.
Wow.
The Yukian people covered this part of California from the Oregon border south to the San Francisco Bay in the Coast Ranges, and probably at one time covered a lot of North America. But at 20,000 years ago, they were right here. I suspect that's also a theory. That's not a fact. That's a theory. I suspect that obsidian knife was made by a Yukian-speaking person that was here 20,000 years ago. The Hokan speakers were over in the Great Basin, Nevada, that area, and the Sierra Nevada, a little bit down into the valley, Central Valley. Here's a fact. We've got two spear points that were found at Elim that are 14,500 years old. They're the oldest spear points in North America.
Huh.
Before these two spear points, the oldest points that had been found in North America were what are called Folsom points or Clovis points. And those were manufactured about 12,000 years ago. So we've got points here in Lake County that are at least 2,000 years older than Clovis and Folsom.
Wow.
Okay? Those points were found at Elim, and when you start studying archaeological sites around the lake, you find that down at Anderson Marsh, Elim, around the southern and eastern arm of the lake, we find several sites that are at least 10,000 years old.
Wow.
We've done studies of the Borax Lake obsidian flow, and we know that the obsidian from that flow has been used for tool making for 14,000 years.
Wow. That's amazing.
So that's the fact. The hypothesis is the Hokan speakers from the Sierras and the Central Valley moved into the Clear Lake Basin about 14,500 years ago and brought with them their technology, their stone tool making technology. And they settled the southern and eastern arm of Clear Lake. Yeah,
Where is Borax Lake?
just north of Clear Lake, north of the town of Clear Lake.
Okay.
Yeah. Have you been over to Clear Lake? Driven around? There's a little road that actually goes past Borax Lake over the hill down to the Sulphur Bank mine.
In Buckingham, is that Little Borax Lake?
That's called Little Borax Lake.
Okay, that's
Yeah.
what I'm, yeah. Thank you.
There's a chair up here if you want to sit.
I'm good, go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna use your leg as my footstool. When I started doing research in the Clear Lake Basin for my dissertation, I looked at all the recorded sites that had been recorded in the area at that point, which is about 1,500 to 2,000 sites. And I looked at only the sites that the archaeologist measured the actual size of the site, either by pacing or using tape measure, because I wanted to know how much site area there was during different time periods. My focus was on population. Okay, we don't do archaeology anymore just for the fun of finding goodies and, gathering knowledge for knowledge's sake. We have too many worldwide problems that need to be solved for scientists to be gathering knowledge for knowledge's sake. So in the 60s, during the Great Awakening, we realized we got to use this science to try to solve some of these world problems that we have. Well, name any world problem, and I guarantee you I can trace it back to overpopulation. Right? Okay. So, overexploitation of resources, unequal distribution of resources, global warming, you can name it. Wars, famine, everything goes back to overpopulation. And archaeology as a science is in a unique position to be able to see changes over long time spans of how people deal with their environment. What they do, what foods do they collect, how do they arrange their economic system, their kinship system, what does that do for population? So I wanted to study this basically isolated lake basin and see if I could see changes in population over time, and if so, how did that show up in the archaeological record? How did that show up in the resources that were around the lake? So I was trying to figure out, okay, how am I going to figure out how many people there were here? There have been studies done in Europe where they did archaeology on old historic sites and counted the number of plows and were able to calculate how many people were in the village based on how many plows were found. Somebody thought, well, maybe we can calculate how many people were in the village based on how many mortars there were in the village, or how many fire pits, or whatever. You can't go to the cemetery and dig them up and say, oh yeah, that's how many people there were, because people didn't always bury right there in that cemetery. They buried. So, and there all these researchers have done all these different studies. I knew I wasn't going to be able to get actual numbers. But if I could see changes, gradual changes, like populations expanding or populations declining, that would be enough for what I wanted to do. So I thought, well, there's got to be a correlation between the amount of site area inhabited and the population size. So if you've got a lot of site area during one time period, chances are you had a bigger population in that time period than another time period where you had less site area being inhabited. Makes perfect sense, doesn't it? So I took 100 sites in the Clear Lake Basin that I could date accurately and measured their sizes and was able to put together a chart showing changes in the amount of site area inhabited over the past 10,000 years. And I was able to determine that the local Native Americans were overpopulated twice during the past 10,000 years. Now, the first people that got here were not overpopulated. They had plenty of resources. And their resources were hand-to-mouth, quick, easy. They didn't have much in the way of tools. They didn't really need much in the way of tools. This was pretty much it. Looks like a creek rock, huh? Yeah, it's been chipped. And this one actually is pretty flat, but most of these that I find have a 60% edge angle to them. I have no idea what they were used for.
Hammer.
Hammer, chopper,
Yeah.
it's a hand axe.
All around
You
too.
call it a treat rock?
Didn't they, you
It,
did use
it's
this
a,
for?
it would look like a creek rock to you, right?
Yeah.
As an archaeologist, I'm looking at these chips and I'm saying, oh yeah, okay. I found this in an area about the size of this house. I found 15 of these in an area far from the nearest creek. There was no other rounded stones in the area. And all but this one actually had this 60-degree edge angle. They were chipped purposefully to make that edge angle for whatever reason. This one has been used so much that it's all the sharp edges have been worn down.
I have some input on what you just said, because around where my little ranch is, you find these rocks that they use for grinding,
Yeah.
but on one end, there's this shape like this.
Really?
I know what it
Cut
is.
yourself.
Yeah.
I'm not
It's
a
a
nurse, so
glacier.
don't bother calling me.
When the glacier came down, they were rolled to the edge, they broke off.
Oh, that could be.
Because I probably found 10 of them.
Yeah.
On one end, they were using this pestles,
Yeah.
and then
I
the
spent
break
my day looking at rocks that jump in.
is consistent. So as it went out on the edge of the glacier, the pressure, it broke it. That's my theory.
That's a theory.
Hypothesis.
A hypothesis, very good hypothesis.
Yeah.
Now, what kind of rock is that that you're passing around? Is
The
it-
round one?
Yeah.
A creek rock. I am not a geologist.
Oh, you're not?
I know I sound really geologic, but I'm not.
Okay.
No, ask me about people. I know all about people in the past.
I got a question.
Nothing about geology. Yeah.
Do you believe that there were giants in the area?
No? Do you?
Don't know.
Okay, good.
How'd the mercury get in the lake?
Mercury comes up, it's part of the volcanic system that's going on here. You've got this heat coming up from below and it's dissolving chemicals in the rocks, and those chemicals come up to the surface. Some of those chemicals are mercury, sulfur, all kinds of different chemicals. And where borax, where the sulfur bank mine is, was a big natural sulfur spring where these chemicals had come up, and they were draining into the lake back then. You know, so it's not something that's new, it's not something that's recent. I'm sure the mining activities made it worse, but
They
there's,
used mercury a lot. to
it's always
separate out
been
all
there,
kinds
yeah.
of things. So
In
they
the-
definitely made it worse.
in the 1800s, before the 1800s, now we're skipping along into the 1800s, and I'm still 20,000 years ago. If you look at the side of Canocti, right over there, there's a big scar with a bunch of white rock.
Yeah.
That's a sulfur mine. And over here, the Esvarez quarry, a bunch of white rock, another sulfur mine. Borax, the sulfur bank mine, a sulfur mine. It was not originally a mercury mine. Sulfur was more important to our economy back in the mid-1800s to about 1860 than mercury was. And because you needed sulfur to dry apricots, to do all kinds of things on your property, and make gunpowder, all this. Some of those rocks you can actually light a match to and they'll burn over there.
Don't give any.
So they were sulfur mines. Then when the gold rush hit and everybody realized that mercury gloms onto gold particles, they started processing mercury. And we got mercury mines all around the place. Up around St. Helena, there's mercury mines. And the sulfur mines turned into mercury mines because the two are usually together in the same rock formation. So that was very important in the late 1800s. And then it kind of went out of favor. And then when the world wars came in, they needed mercury for mercury switches and timers and stuff like that for
armaments.
for armaments. So they reopened a lot of those mines with new technology and harvested more mercury out of them. So
So you
that's,
can't get rid of it. You can't.
no, it's here. It's here to stay.
Yeah.
However, remember what I was saying about the lake bed?
That's so-
This much sediment comes in to the lake every year, the same amount of sediment as the lake bed downfalls every year. So over time, all the mercury is a heavy metal. It sinks to the bottom. Over time, it will be completely covered and buried with lake bed sediment and rendered harmless to us.
Oh, wow.
So
Yeah, we just don't happen to live in that time.
depends on where you are.
It's nice knowing you.
It depends on where you are, yeah. Certain fish are a problem. I wouldn't eat catfish on a daily basis over by the Oaks.
Well,
Most fish are territorial, so, you know, bass and catfish are gonna stay pretty close to where they were born. So, but I wouldn't worry at all about catfish or bass anywhere else around the lake. Or over by the Oaks, I'd be a little bit leery about it, you know. Maybe once a week, but not every day. So, and eventually it'll heal itself, yeah.
I have a question. Can you tell me which came first, the Elam Indian colony or the Sulphur Bay mine?
The Elam Indian Colony has been there for 14,000 years.
Okay.
Wow.
Do you know anywhere else in the world where one community of people have lived in one spot for 14,000 years? Because I don't. Not even in the Middle East. I mean, people move, you know, there's wars, there's, you know, population change, these people have been here. So the Hokan speakers came up from the valley, we think about 14,000 years ago. They brought with them these new spear points. And they either married into or just pushed aside the Yukian speaking people that were already here. But there were such small groups, it wasn't like, they're taking over my territory. It wasn't a big deal. There are still Yukian speaking people in California. The Middletown Wapo is a Yukian speaking tribe. And there's actually a tribe north of the Pomo called the Yuki.
yeah.
But those are the only two fragments left of the Yukian language family.
But I assume somebody has to make a joke about Ukiah, right?
Ukiah.
Yeah.
Ukiah, yeah, I know. So the Hokan people ended up here, we think about 14,000 years ago, settled in the southern and eastern arm of Clear Lake, and had a very small population, but thriving, did good job. They were, you know, eating hand-to-mouth berries and roots, things that you didn't have to cook, you didn't have to grind, you didn't have to do anything, just boom, 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 you know. And that was great, and they did good until about 8,000 years ago. The last global warming started 8,000 years ago. Temperature probably 5 degrees warmer than today. So instead of 110 during the summer, 115. 5 inches less rainfall a year. Okay? During the Ice Age, which is what was around 14,000 years ago, it rained here year-round. From, in fact, if you look in the hills, way up on the top of the hills, you see the pine forests up there? That's a remnant of the Ice Age forests that covered this whole area. It was pine forests all the way down to the lakeshore. All the way down. Pine and cedar, all those kinds of trees. And we know this because
The pollen.
the pollen in those core samples of the lake bed sediment, right?
Yeah.
There's a chart that actually shows the pine pollen, and 8,000 years ago, the pine pollen drops off and is taken over by oak pollen. Yeah.
Can I ask a question about the pollen? How many different kinds of pollen can they detect when they're looking at all those pollen layers? Do they get pollen from, do they know what kind of pollens they are, like hundreds of them or thousands of them?
Yeah, hundreds
All
at
the
least.
plants?
Yeah.
They can isolate all of them?
Yeah, they have, what are those called? Those electron microscope
Yeah.
images of different pollen grains. And
Oh,
so
yeah.
they actually take a block of pollen grains and count, you know, to determine the percentage of the different types of pollen.
Okay, so
And then
they
they
can pretty
extrapolate, they infer.
Identify everything that was growing at that
Right,
time?
yeah, they can reconstruct the environment during the Ice Age, after the Ice Age, yeah.
Were
So-
there redwoods here?
Hmm?
Were there coastal redwoods in this
There were
area?
redwoods, yeah, redwoods, mostly pine and cedar, but there were some redwoods, yeah. Because, yeah, rain year-round, yeah.
Is it a myth that the vents that are in Canocti, that the Indians used to drop the logs down and they'd come out?
Nice story.
They gotta get.
I cannot tell you whether that's true or not. When I was, 35 years ago, I spent a lot of time in Henry Malden's living room typing cards for his card catalog file of his historical notes, and we would talk, and he remembers going up there to try to find the cave, and that the mouth of the cave had fallen in, but he had talked to the family that owned the property, and they said that yes, there was a cave and you could crawl back in there, and it was a drop off, and they were worried apparently about dangerous fumes or something, so they went in there and they had a kerosene lantern on a rope, and they lowered it down as far as the rope would go, and they never hit the bottom. And then apparently at one point somebody took a bale of hay, set it on fire, and kicked it over the edge, and it went out before it hit the bottom. And somebody dropped a rock, you know, figuring if it hits another rock you'll hear it. Never heard it. But if a rock were to hit water, you might not hear it.
Yeah.
You know, so those are the stories that I've heard. I have heard the myth that you can carve a piece of wood and throw it in there and it'll come out clearly, just like the Blue Lake story.
Mm-hmm.
But you know, I'm a scientist. If I see it, I'll believe it. Right now, it's just myths and legends. It's history, his story. It's someone's story about the past. It's not what really happened. It's someone's story based on their own observations and biases, yeah.
Speaking of the Ice Age, should they ever find mastodon bones here?
We do have them, yes. Mammoths, saber-toothed cats. They've down in the Cache Creek flows out into the Central Valley. There's a big gravel quarry right there. And they found a complete mastodon, a woolly mammoth, right there. In fact, it's on display at Sonoma State, I think. So yeah, they were here. All those animals. So, the end of the Ice Age, drastic weather change with the last global warming. And so, it changed the environment. The pine forests were forced up in elevation because there was much less water. The oaks in the chaparral and the grasslands could take over. Oak trees don't like water. Their root systems will start to rot if there's too much water around an oak tree's root. So it does.
That's why oak trees fall down in big winds.
Yeah. Oh yeah. And if you have a nice green lawn in front of your house with an oak tree growing in it, just watering your lawn every week will kill that oak tree because the roots don't like that water. So decide what you want: a lawn or acorns. So these people had already been dependent on these resources that were water-oriented, marshland resources, easy resources, hand-to-mouth. You can eat tule roots, you can eat the base of the tules, you know, strawberries, blackberries, all these kinds of easy to gather and eat things. And all of a sudden, the climate changes, and they found themselves overpopulated. Their population was here, their food source dropped. Overpopulation doesn't mean overcrowding. It means you have more people than your technology can feed. Okay? So they had to come up with a change, with something new. Turns out they had all these grasses growing around, and all these grasses had little seed pods, grain. So they developed a new technology that used a flat slab of stone, it's just a broken piece of one, and a hand stone, a mono, for cracking open those grass seed grains and getting the nutritious meat out of them. Pass these around. This is a lot of work. You had to wander through the fields, get those grass seeds off of the ends of those stalks, whatever, and grind them and pound them and make them into something you could eat. And you can see these hand stones were used so much, they were polished smooth, and they had to take a harder rock and peck on them to rough them up again to be able to continue to use them. So their first experience of overpopulation they were able to take on a new technology and a new food source, which allowed them to continue to survive and prosper. In fact, they got so good that by 6,000 years ago, their population was growing again around the lake basin. Grain production. By the way, that global warming period that started about 8,000 years ago affected everyone all around the world. This is when crops were developed in the Tigris-Euphrates River Valley. This is when beans and corn were starting to be cultivated in Central America. All around the world, people had to adapt to this global warming period. And it wasn't just a few years. The global warming period lasted 4,000 years.
Yeah.
They got so good at that the population kept growing and growing and growing to the point where they had outstripped the grain resources of the Clear Lake Basin. Yeah.
How much did the population shrink at that 8,000 year?
I don't know the exact numbers, but
No, but-
but my charts actually do show a drop in the amount of site area inhabited
Right.
right at that time period.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then it started.
And then it starts up
started
again.
So you said by 10,000 or
Right,
so.
well, yeah,
it was
8,000 years ago it started dropping off.
Uh-huh.
And then they took this on at 8,000 years ago. About 6,000 years ago it starts going up again.
Okay.
And they get so good at it that they overpopulate based on grain resources. About 7,000 years ago it starts going up again. About 6,000 years ago, all of a sudden the amount of site area starts to shrink again. And that's a fact. My hypothesis is that they've outstripped the grain resources and the population's starting to drop again because they've over exploited the resource. And they didn't have a new food resource yet to cover their ass.
What was the percentage level of the declines and then the rise?
I'm gonna actually give you a handout that shows the graph.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So they needed a new food resource, and they came up with one that we're all familiar with now.
Here.
Let's see what I got in here. Ah,
Acorns.
da-da-da-da. Acorns.
Learned how to process.
They actually knew how to process acorns 8,000 or 9,000 years ago. But it's poisonous and it takes a lot of work. So you're not going to eat acorns unless you absolutely have to.
Yeah.
By 6,000 years ago, they had gotten to the point where they absolutely had to. It is a lot of hard work. You gotta get a big round stone and make a hole in it like this. You gotta find another rock and try to make it this shape and crack those acorns open and pound away at them in here. And that's great, and it makes you a nice powdery acorn. Acorn powder, I've got some here if you want to try some. Acorn powder.
Don't you have to leach that?
Oh yeah, it's still poisonous. Yeah. Yeah, they're full of tannic acid, which we can't handle really, and if you eat a couple of acorns, it's no big deal. If you eat about 10 or 12, you'll probably get sick to your stomach. If that doesn't give you a hint, and you keep eating acorns, they could eventually kill you, yeah. But, you know, any poisonous food usually warns you first. You know, usually it tastes terrible, and you spit it out.
That's heavy.
But if you're not that smart and you keep eating it, the next thing it does is make you throw up. And then if you're still that dumb that you're gonna keep eating it, then you're in trouble. Deer don't have that problem. They love acorns and they can digest tannic acid just fine. We can't. So you have to take this ground up acorn and go down to a creek and make kind of a dish shape out of the sand along the banks of the creek, put some leaves down, put the acorn grindings there and drip water over it for half an hour to leach out the tannic acid. Then you can make it into bread or soup or mush or ferment it and make wine. It doesn't matter, whatever you want to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I know when I was talking to some people that knew the old history, further north, some of the Uroks and Wyroks, they used to just put the acorns whole in a bag, according to stories that I was told anyway. Put them in a bag, throw them in a creek and leave them in there for 3 or 4 days.
Yeah, that might work.
And then it would leach the tannin out
Sure.
without, and then they'd make a powder of it
Yeah,
afterwards.
afterwards.
They didn't have to powder it, according to
Yeah.
the stories that I heard anyway. I don't know if it's true or not, it was
I
stories.
don't know, around here, they ground
That
it
would be more
first.
efficient.
It seemed like it would.
Yeah, they just throw them in a stream in a bag for several days and it would leach the tannin out. So I guess
Took a
there's
while.
Yeah.
different technologies everywhere.
Mhm.
So obsidian is found throughout the Americas.
Yeah, mostly in volcanic areas along the west coast.
Because my dad has quite the collection from his property of obsidian arrowheads. But I didn't think it was indigenous to where we were and that the natives used it. But it didn't necessarily come from like a place like here through trade. I mean,
Yeah,
it was traded heavily, I'm assuming.
it was, this Borax Lake obsidian that we had, that was being prepared here, was traded over to the Sierras, up to Oregon, down to
Okay.
Central California.
That's what I was wondering.
Right, we have Oregon obsidian on the shores of Morro Bay, Napa obsidian all over California.
Okay.
Yeah, it was a major trade commodity, and because the Pomo controlled one of the primary obsidian sources, they were fairly wealthy people. I mean, they were able to, they produced that handstone that chopping tool that I passed around, I don't know where it went. That's also would be considered a trade blank. And men would be out on that obsidian flow, chipping those things out by the hundreds, just for trade.
Yeah.
And the people in the Clear Lake Basin controlled that flow of Borax Lake obsidian. They also controlled a stone that was considered gold by the Native Americans called magnesite, which made these beautiful salmon orange, salmon red beads. And those were valued all over North America and traded. And they also controlled access along the major trade route that went from the coast to the Central Valley. So those three things meant that these people here, at the time the Europeans arrived, these people were very wealthy and very high status as far as California Native communities went. Yeah.
During that time of population change, what happened to the fish and game that the deer and the fish?
Good question. The very first people that arrived here, the deer had no experience with this new hunter. You know, so you could walk right up to a deer and stab them. All you needed was a sharpened stick. They weren't going to run away. I mean, a few of them might run away, okay? But they really were not used to this new predator. So if you think about natural selection, and you being part of the natural selection process as the hunter, and the deer just standing there and letting you stab it, and these other ones run away, those other ones are going to have babies. The babies are going to have the genetic code in them to want to run away from you. Eventually, you're going to have killed all the ones that were dumb enough to just stand there. And the only ones left are going to be the ones that are running away from you. So, you're going to have to invent another tool to get a deer further away from you. So they invented what's called a dart and an atlatl. It's a stick about this long with a hook on the end that you hang on to, and that hook hooks into a dart, which is about this long, and the dart point is almost as big as a spear point, about a third smaller. These three down here would be dart points. And if you've ever gone fishing, you know, you use a spinning rod. You know how you hook your finger over the string and you flip the bail back and you go like this and let your finger go?
Yeah.
That's exactly how you throw a dart with an atlatl. You hang on to the atlatl, you hook your finger over the dart, and you go like this, and as you're throwing, you let your finger go, And that acts as an extension of your arm, and it throws that thing 50 yards with accuracy.
Wow.
Yeah, a dart and an atlatl. And that was invented about 6,000 years ago.
Wow.
Right about when that population decline was occurring.
Kind of like when they invented the sling.
Yeah,
People
slings,
got to be pretty accurate with that.
very accurate. We have slings all over that they were using around Lake County. We haven't been able to determine what time period these came into use yet. These you'll find all around the lake shore.
Oh, yeah.
You wade out into the water. There's so many of them that locals thought they were natural. These are baked clay balls. If you look at them closely, you'll actually see little bits of obsidian and other stuff embedded in the clay. These were sling stones.
That's so cool.
And they're all over Lake County. I don't know how many thousands of years they were using slings, but you would have a pouch, a leather pouch with long leather thong on either side. Put that stone in there, around your head, let one of those thongs loose, the stone goes flying. If you have a flock of ducks or geese, you could probably hit 3 or 4 at once. We're still trying to figure out how long ago those were used. There's some other artifacts that we find in sites around the lake that you probably wouldn't even recognize if you saw one. This one here is kind of,
No, I've seen.
it's a nice skipping rock, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, but notice there's a little notch taken out of
Yeah,
this.
on all sides.
Just right for sewing or tying on to a fishing net. It's a net weight. Not a very fancy one. This was a much more fancy net weight, just a part of one, but it actually had a groove pecked all the way around the stone to tie it onto the net. Fishing was mostly done with nets. You didn't, you know, fishing with a hook is not very efficient. Birding.
Only one fish.
Birding with a sling is good if you're going for waterfowl. If you're going for smaller birds, you want to use a basket, open wicker basket. You wait for the woodpecker to go in its hole, and then you go up and hammer a basket over its hole so it can't get out. You don't, a lot of people see these little arrow points. That thing, that rack that I just passed around had little teeny points. Those are arrow points. Every other point you've seen is a spear point or a dart point. The bow and arrow I haven't even talked about because it was only invented 500 years before Europeans arrived. We have 14,000 years of people here using a spear and 6,000 years of them using darts and atlatls before the bow and arrow was even invented. You do not use arrows for birds. Collectors call those things bird points, just because they're small and they think, oh, what could they use this for? It must be birds. No. An arrow only needs to be as wide as the arrow shaft.
Yeah.
Anything bigger than that creates too much weight and the arrow will just boom to the ground. So you want something really small, really light, just as wide as the shaft is. You would not go after birds with a bow and arrow. You'd use a basketry trap. Or I actually have seen arrows for getting birds. They don't have a point on the end. They have
Flat.
cross sticks
Yeah.
lashed to the end of the arrow to knock the bird out.
I've got
Rather
one
than
of
try
those
to
from the
stab.
Midwest, one of them.
Yeah.
Bird head.
So where are we?
Bird
We're
point.
6,000 years ago. They just invented acorn processing. And boy, did they like that stuff, and the population took off. Took off. All the way up until about 3,500 years ago. They completely populated the lakeshore. They've already moved into the uplands. They're using resources all over the Clear Lake area, the region, and the population is still growing. It's growing so quickly and getting so dense in the Clear Lake Basin that, you know, the kids, they're getting married and they're thinking, it's just too crowded around here. Let's go over to the Russian River. There's fewer people over there. So Pomo from around Clear Lake start marrying into or displacing the Yukian speakers that were over in the Russian River and further on over to the coast and down to Cloverdale and up to, you know, whatever. So about 3,500 years ago, the Pomo around Clear Lake spread all the way to the coast.
Wow.
We know this because the historical linguists have looked at the Pomo dialects in all these other places and have been able to recreate what the Proto-Pomo language was. And they looked specifically at words that describe plants and animals. And the Proto-Pomo language, plants and animals, are all plants and animals that are only found around Clear Lake. So they knew where the Pomo language originated.
Oh, for goodness sake.
The southeastern Pomo, those people that arrived here 14,000 years ago, Anderson Marsh and the Clear Lake Oaks area, are the Proto-Pomo speakers.
Wow.
And their language diffused all the way over to the coast by about 3,500 years ago. You know, and you get a language gets isolated in a valley, it doesn't take long before it turns into a dialect, a separate language. Now, you can go to England, which speaks a different dialect than we speak here, and you're going to understand probably 80 or 90% of what they're saying. But, you know, if you want to, you know, get your prescription refilled, you know, you're going to ask where the drugstore is, and they're going to look at you funny, and they're going to say, oh, you mean the chemist? You know, I mean, there's certain things you're not going to understand. If you go to Ireland, it'll be even less, because that's another dialect removed from American English. So every dialect area you cross, you understand less and less and less. The people at Clear Lake could not really talk to the people at the coast, even though they were speaking Pomo. It was so many dialects removed, it was almost another language. Yeah. So it was kind of an interesting, it doesn't take long for language to change once people are isolated. What kind of goodies do I have here? Oh, I got some, lots of cool pictures. So, beginning about 6,000 years ago, when everybody was having a hard time with it and had to come up with new technologies for food, that's when we see territorial boundaries established around the Clear Lake Basin. The studies that I did, I was able to locate all these prehistoric sites. I was able to figure out what time periods the sites were inhabited. I made maps showing where the sites were 10,000 years ago, where they were 8,000, 7,000, 6,000, 5,000. These maps, starting 6,000 years ago, there are sites all around the lake, about 7 miles from each other, about a 1 day's hike between sites. And from 6,000 years ago all the way up to when the Europeans arrived, those site locations don't change, which tells me these people have permanent territorial boundaries. This is our territory, that's their territory. As soon as you set up permanent territorial boundaries, Jesus Christ, you guys are sitting here a long time. As soon as you set up territorial boundaries, if you want something in someone else's territory, you got to trade for it or exchange for it or something, you know. Yeah, I mean, the Elim Pomo had the Borax Lake obsidian flow. If the Danocha from Upper Lake wanted some Borax Lake obsidian, they'd have to come to the Elim Pomo and say, hey, can we get some obsidian? And so 6,000 years ago, we see another thing show up in archaeological sites. That's really cool. In fact, it shows up all over California. Shell beads.
Yeah.
Shell beads. Made out of clam shells, got from the coast, drilled, made round. Really cool stuff.
Money.
Money. Yeah, a medium of exchange. So if you don't have something of equal value right now to trade for this, you know, hey, how about a string of beads? You know, and I'm sure that it started innocently enough. You know, these are actually keyhole limpets that you can find over at the coast. These particular ones are from a 3,000-year-old Chumash site down in San Luis Obispo County. keyhole limpets have a natural hole in them, so they're real easy to string. And I can just imagine these people around the lake going over to the Russian River, and somebody over there has a string of these around their neck just as decoration. And this person from the lake says, "Wow, that's neat. Can I have that?" And the guy from over there says, "Well, we got this from the people over at the coast, and yeah, you can have it if you give me that bag of obsidian you got there." You know, so it starts innocently enough, you know, and over a few hundred years, it's okay, well, one string of beads is worth, you know. By the time the Europeans arrived, it was a money economy.
Pretty soon you got Wall Street, right?
Right, it was a money economy. There were people in each village that basically just sat around and made beads. And I'm going to show you a picture here. This was taken by Edward Curtis of a Pomo woman.
Look at the beads.
And what is she doing here? She is showing you her wealth.
That's right.
Curtis didn't have a clue what he was taking a picture. He was taking a picture of a Pomo woman that was showing off her wealth. For 3 strings of beads, you could get a bow and a quiver of arrows from a professional bow maker. By this time, we've got professions. We got professional basket makers, professional bow makers, professional fishermen, professional hunters. If you want to get a deer during the time of the year when they're not in herds, you have to hire a professional hunter to go out and get it for you. You know, if you want to, you can hire a fisherman to go out and pay shell beads and get a percentage of his catch. Professional basket makers. Here's a professional bead maker from 1906. This was taken at Big Valley. His name is Ka'aidano. He's stringing a shell bead. He's sitting on a woven tule mat. He's got a whole bunch of shell beads on the ground in front of him.
Making money.
Making money.
Yeah.
So at the time the Europeans arrived, we had set territorial boundaries. Now these go back about 6,000 years. This is a map that was done in 1919 based on interviews with tribal elders done in the 1880s. Some of those tribal elders had survived the Bloody Island Massacre. I'll pass this around. The big triangles here are where the political centers were of each tribal territory. Do you know why our coins are round today? Because our money economy started out as shell beads.
Right.
Way back. In fact, in China, a coin still has to have a hole in it to be valuable. Yeah. Pretty exciting. Let's take a break. I want everybody to get up, stretch their legs, have something to drink or munch on. Ooh, I'm going to get the first one. I'm going to say